Now, the rest of the story. No one at London Hospital, patient or staff, would ever forget a nurse named Julia. A truly beautiful woman. Fine, perfectly proportioned features, warm, sweet, expressive eyes. So lovely was she inside and out that her own handicaps were mostly overlooked. Rheumatic fever, contracted in her young womanhood, left her lame and hard of hearing. One knee would remain rod-stiff for the rest of her life, and her deafness would continue to worsen over the years, and yet Julia, always active, always athletic, refused to be shelved by her infirmities. And although her lameness ended her participation in gymnastics, she still glided gracefully as she walked, and continued to ride and to ice skate, even to dance as beautifully and skillfully as ever before. Her considerable physical strength would always serve her well, for despite her diminutive size, she could lift people larger than she, and carry them with outstretched arms, apparently effortlessly. However, as a practical nurse, nobody could have been less practical. She spent far too long with each of her patients, longer than a regular daily schedule would allow. But Julia would never have agreed that it made her days unnecessarily long. Her protracted, serious, encouraging talks with those in her charge probably all in all had a greater effect on them than the strictly medical aspects of their treatments. There was one young man in the hospital who'd suffered a leg injury, had just been informed that his knee would be permanently stiff, and yet just as the patient was sinking into understandable despair, Julia appeared at the bedside. She said, "My dear, dear man, I hear you have a stiff leg. So have I. And now just watch what I can do with it." And with that, Julia lifted her skirt and swept her lame leg easily up over the top of the bedside table. Julia would not leave a ward until she'd spoken to every patient. Her quick sympathy and personal concern for each was utterly genuine. And administrator, no. Now, she was not a very good one. Still, she was elected president of 2 nursing boards, and she was instrumental, despite the initial opposition of hospital authorities, instrumental in pioneering the use of the Finson lamp for the treatment of lupus. Her personal life was burdened otherwise. Her increasing deafness, which had isolated her from so many simple pleasures, made it eventually necessary to study lip reading. A flagrantly philandering husband scarcely helped matters. But through it all, through her tireless, selfless service of the sick and her own private battles, Julia maintained a splendid, self-confident attitude, tolerating all but a pompous or prudish attitude of others. London Hospital was her hospital, she always said, as though it belonged to her personally, and it might have been given her had she asked for it. I said it might have been given her had she asked for it. Oh, I don't think I mentioned Julia, Alexandra Caroline Marie Charlotte Louise Julia, was the Danish wife of King Edward VII, was, in addition to all else, in the first decade of the 20th century, Queen of England. And now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. Alexandra Caroline Marie Charlotte Louise Julia. Man, that's a mouthful. She was mostly known by her shortened name, Alexandra of Denmark. Her immediate family called her Alex. Alexandra was born in December 1844 into a modest family. Wait a minute, she was royalty. Well, let me explain. Her father was Prince Christian of, I'm going to say this slowly, Schleswig, Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg. His only income was from an army commission. The family lived in a small house, rent-free, because of his military service in combination with his being a prince. In 1848, when Alexandra was 4 years old, King Christian VIII of Denmark died, and his only son, Frederick, became King of Denmark. Frederick had been married twice but was unable to have children. This led to a succession crisis. It Eventually, European powers agreed that Prince Christian, although long down the line, Alexandra's father, would become king. Although his status improved, his finances did not. In 1863, upon the death of King Frederick, Prince Christian became King Christian IX of Denmark. Got it? Good. There'll be a test later. Just kidding. In 1861, 2 years before her father became King of Denmark, Queen Victoria of England and her husband, Prince Albert, began looking for a bride for their 19-year-old son and heir to the throne, Albert Edward. All available royal females within a certain age range, including Alexandra, were rejected for one reason or another. Finally, they considered all possible candidates again. They had to find one and narrowed their selection down to Alexandra. She was the only one who fit. At the time, Prince Albert Edward was having an affair with Nellie Clifton, an Irish actress, while a student at Cambridge. When Queen Victoria and Prince Albert learned of the affair, they were livid. The press had learned about it too. They feared that the affair would lead to blackmail, pregnancy, and scandal. At the time, Prince Albert was fighting a cold. He'd recently learned that 2 of his young cousins, King Pedro V of Portugal and his brother Ferdinand, had died of typhoid fever in a period of just 5 days. But despite his illness, Prince Albert left for Cambridge. When he arrived, Prince Albert and his son, Prince Albert Edward, took a long walk to discuss the affair. It was raining at the time of their walk. When Prince Albert, that's Queen Victoria's husband, returned to Windsor Castle, his illness had worsened. His symptoms included high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, constipation, headaches, vomiting, and confusion. On December 9, 1861, his doctors diagnosed him with typhoid fever. 5 days later, 42-year-old Prince Albert died in the presence of Queen Victoria and 5 of her 9 children. Queen Victoria blamed her son and his affair with Nellie for the death of her beloved Prince Albert. At the time, there was no treatment for typhoid fever, but thanks to modern medicine, treatment with antibiotics has reduced the fatality rate of typhoid fever to about 1%. That's amazing. In September 1862, after only meeting her once, Albert Edward proposed to Alexandra. A few months later, Alexandra left Denmark aboard the royal yacht Victoria and Albert. She arrived in Gravesend, Kent on March 7, 1863. 3 days later, Albert Edward and Alexandra were married at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. Alexandra was dignified and charming in public, as members of the royal family were expected to be, but in private, Alexandra was said to be affectionate and jolly. She enjoyed life. She loved dancing, ice skating, riding horses, hunting, much to the chagrin of Queen Victoria, who asked her to stop doing those activities. Alexandra ignored her and kept on enjoying life. Alexandra loved being part of the social scene as well. Alexandra gave birth to her first child, a son they named Albert Victor, in 1864. 5 more children followed: George, Louise, Victoria, Maud, and Alexander. In 1867, around the time of the birth of her third child, Louise, Alexandra got an infection in her throat. She began running a fever, her joints began to ache, and the muscles in her legs moved involuntarily. She was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, which resulted in the paralysis that Mr. Harvey told us about. For months, Alexandra walked with the aid of 2 walking sticks. As was the case with Prince Albert, Alexandra's bout of rheumatic fever could have been treated if they'd have had antibiotics. Throughout their marriage, Alexandra's husband, Albert Edward, continued to keep company with other women, one of which was a society matron named Alice Keppel. We can only speculate as to the exact nature of their friendship. Alexandra was well aware of Albert Edward's friendships with other women. But of all the women, I intentionally mentioned Alice Keppel. Years later, when Albert Edward was dying, Alexandra allowed Alice Keppel to visit the king on his deathbed. In the late 1860s, Alexandra started losing her hearing. Otosclerosis, sometimes called otospongiosis, ran in her family. Rheumatic fever may have been a contributing factor in her hearing loss as well. Despite her limp and her hearing problems, Alexandra still enjoyed being a working royal. Queen Victoria wrote that Alexandra undertook many public duties to spare me the strain and fatigue of functions. She opens bazaars, attends concerts, visits hospitals in my place. She not only never complains, but endeavors to prove that she has enjoyed what to another would be a tiresome duty. Alexandra went far beyond what was expected of her as a working royal. She spent a lot of time, especially in the London hospital. One of the people she spent time with was Joseph Merrick. Now, Joseph Merrick was born in 1862 and appeared like any other normal child. However, when Joseph was about 4 years old, his body began to show signs of deformity. His deformities worsened with age. So shocking were his deformities that he wore a cap and a hood when he went into public. In his 20s, Joseph was exhibited in sideshows, then called freak shows, under the stage name The Elephant Man. The exact cause of his deformities remains unclear. After his death, his skeleton was bleached and put on display at the Royal London Hospital. Recent DNA tests done on his hair and bones were inconclusive because his skeleton had been bleached numerous times. Many people feared Joseph, but not Alexandra. She loved visiting with all of the patients. She was not a stuffy royal by any means. She joked around and laughed, anything she could do to brighten people's day. They enjoyed her company, and she enjoyed theirs. While the press looked for any reason to take a stab at Queen Victoria or Albert Edward, they adored Alexandra. Alexandra was the Princess Diana of the late 1800s. The public cheered when they saw her. She always smiled and waved to them. She always gave them her time. Alexandra was Queen of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions and Empress of India from January 22, 1901, when Queen Victoria died, until her husband, King Emperor Edward VIII, died on May 6, 1910. Then she became Queen Mother, or as the vernacular, Queen Mum. Through her paralysis and hearing loss, Alexandra kept a positive attitude. She could have said, I can't do this anymore. I can't walk anymore. I can't ride a horse anymore. But she was determined to do all of those things. And we can learn a lot from Alexandra. There's so much we can do if we just have determination. Don't you think? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.